A little more than a decade ago, I was a 19-year-old student at a small Midwest college. I was still taking my general courses and happened to have an evening psychology course with 40 to 50 fellow students. We broke into small groups to discuss readings and assignments on a regular basis. That's where I met a fellow student named James. There was nothing creepy about James, and we were no more than casual classroom acquaintances. This comes into play later on. I have a relative who is a Catholic priest, and we would travel to his home on the Easter holiday to celebrate with him and sometimes guests of his inviting. One particular Easter, he invited a colleague of his. The colleague was also planning on becoming a priest and was learning from the particular church he was assigned to. He came off as a mostly quiet, focused man, nothing out of the norm for someone who was a third wheel at a family dinner. The day wore on and there were card games and drinks. It wasn't a secret that this man enjoyed having a beer or two. I found it a little odd that he was drinking heavily, but then again, so were others. I remember leaving the get-together and shaking hands with him, an awkward interaction at best, and that was, what I thought, the last I would hear about him. Flash forward a few months and there was news of a murder in a funeral home not far from the small Midwest college I attend. The murder goes unsolved for quite some time. The part that hits home with this murder, James was the victim, the same James I had psychology class with. He was interning to be a mortician and was shot at the funeral home of his internship. A number of months later, I see news reports and read articles on a big break in the case. The same priest that I had met at Easter dinner had been assigned to a new parish. The new parish had mixed feelings about his demeanor, and there were allegations of improper conduct with children in the community. Apparently, the director of the funeral home was about to confront the priest with the allegations. Knowing this, the priest went to the funeral home and murdered the director, along with James. Not only did I shake the murderer's hand, I had also known one of the victims. It still chills me to the bone to this day. This story didn't happen to me, but to my older sister. A little background info before we get started. My family used to live in a very small southern town in South Carolina. My sister worked at a Piggly Wiggly, which is a grocery store if some of you are not aware. Working at the Piggly Wiggly was my sister's first job, and she was about 16 or 17 at the time, and she worked until pretty late hours of the night, usually till about 10 p.m. or so. Her time working there was pretty pleasant, being a small town. Everyone pretty much knows everyone anyway, so no creeps really. Until this one. This fairly young priest would come into the store all the time, and my sister always got a creepy vibe from him, but dismissed it because all the other employees and customers seemed to really like the guy. One night my sister was the last one to clock out, and when she was walking to her car, she noticed the well-liked priest sitting on this bench that was across the street from the entrance of the store. He was just smiling, so my sister, being friendly, smiled back until she saw what exactly the priest was doing. He was masturbating right in front of her, and when he noticed her facial expression change in shock, he fully revealed himself to her. My sister was disgusted, and she quickly ran to her car and drove off. Once she got home, she told my parents, and they reported it to the authorities, but nothing ever happened to the priest. My sister didn't see him around the store anymore. If not dead, there's no telling what that priest did before or after this incident. Being someone people usually trust, he could have easily showed himself or assaulted another woman. I was about 15 and had experienced strange men following and talking to me and many of my friends, so I know how to act around them and to avoid them. It's important to know that I live in a neighborhood where there is quite a bit of violence, drug use, rape, gangs, and occasionally a few shootings. It was a nice sunny Saturday afternoon, and I had decided to take my dog for a walk around the block. The park behind my house joins the next street over to my street. It's like a big loop, so to get home you walk through the park. My street and the one next to it are also dead ends, and there are never any people around. It's very peaceful but can get creepy at times. I used to walk past a man who kept a giant knife in his sock on my way home from school, and there have been a few times where the cops have been called around nighttime because of strange people in the park doing bad things, but during the day it's pretty safe and quite beautiful. As I reached the beginning of the park, I saw a priest sitting on one of the park benches looking at the trees. I didn't think much of him because we do surprisingly have 2 Greek churches in our neighborhood. He was an older man, maybe around 60 to 65 years old, so if he was going to make a move, I didn't think he could do much. I walked past him with my dog and out of the corner of my eye, saw his head turn to look at me. I brushed it off because, after all, I was the only other person in the park. But after I took about 5 more steps, I heard leaves behind me crunching, so I looked back only to see that the priest had gotten up and was slowly heading in my direction. At this point, I was a bit anxious, and he was starting to creep me out a bit, but I pushed my thoughts aside and just said I was overthinking. I kept walking through the park with about 250 meters to my house. The park is very open with only a few trees which are spread apart, so it's easy to see everything and everyone. As I walked home, I kept looking behind me and seeing where the priest was. He was still following me, and his steps were in sync with mine at this point. I was creeped out, but I didn't want to run just in case he started running. I just acted casual, but kept a close eye on what he was doing. I was nearly at the end of the park and about to turn into my street. I decided to look back at the priest one more time. This time when I looked, he stopped walking and smiled at me, but not a normal smile. It was a big, creepy smile that gave me chills. My dog even noticed what I was doing and began barking at the priest. My dog barks at a lot of people, so this was normal, but it snapped me back into reality, and I decided to bolt back to my house. As soon as I began running, the priest picked up pace and started chasing after me. He caught up pretty quick for a guy his age. I was actually impressed for a second. He got close enough to reach his arm out and attempt to grab the hood of my jacket. At that point, I screamed and was about to cry. I made it home, and luckily the door was unlocked. I got inside with the dog and was panting. I never told anyone what happened, but I continued to watch the priest from my kitchen window. He stood outside my home for a bit, trying to look in, but then he turned around and started to head back to the park. He looked as though he was mumbling something to himself. When I was 25, my grandmother passed away, so I went with my mom and dad to the small town where she had been living, where my parents had grown up, for the funeral. My grandparents had been very Catholic, so there were 6 kids and a lot of cousins all converging on the area, most of us staying in the house where the majority of them grew up. On the day of the wake, we all went to the funeral home. My grandmother had had a lot of friends, and a lot of people showed up to pay their respects. My mother's siblings and many of their kids, along with my parents and I, all ended up in the horribly unpleasant phenomenon known as the receiving line, where everyone offers platitudes at you and you are supposed to feel comforted or something. I was standing very near the open casket between my mother and father, shaking hands with strangers and hearing variations on, "I'm sorry for your loss," over and over, when this elderly priest approached. He skipped my father, who was never Catholic, completely, and took my hands in his. He then went on at length about what a beautiful daughter my parents had, while alternately staring into my eyes and then at my chest. Again, this is in a funeral home next to my dead grandmother, and he is a priest. After about a minute of this, he went and shook my mother's hand and eventually remembered why he was there and said some cliches at my mother. I said just loud enough for my parents to hear, "Did that actually just happen?" Because I honestly could not believe it. Apparently it had. It's still the baseline in my family for the most awkward situation imaginable. This happened to me when I lived briefly in Mexico. It happened about a year ago, but I remember it clearly. I was in the shower in my apartment when I get a knock on the front door. Naturally, I ignored it since it's usually a drug addict or a stereotypical con artist salesperson type. After 4 minutes, the knocking continues. I get out of the shower. With a towel around my waist, I peek through the eye hole and noticed a young Caucasian priest outside my apartment. I disabled the lock but left the chain on the door and opened it. This was a stupid mistake. The priest says, "Good evening, sir. Are you by chance a Christian?" "No, I'm not religious. I am one of the many priests who are trying to save the many souls infected by the devil and temptation." "Dude, I'm not interested in religion." This angers the priest. "Listen, your very soul is at risk. I'm trying to save you from the devil and you're putting yourself at great risk." "Look, I don't give a fuck about religion. You're annoying me, so leave." The priest puts his foot in front of the door and proceeds to shout random Bible stuff. I didn't know how to react, but at that moment, the priest accidentally shoved me and my towel dropped low enough to expose my privates to him. This gives me enough time to slam the door and lock it. As he left the building, he was shouting crap about hell and Satan. Soon enough, I moved out and moved to the United States. I've had similar experience to this, but I personally found this one fairly creepy. My family are quite religious, and up until turning 18, they insisted upon taking me to our local temple every Sunday. Since then, I go very irregularly, but over a period of a couple months, 2 years ago when I was 23, I was going every week due to various family functions. As it is a small temple, I've always known of the people that are always there. From the kitchen helpers to the priests, there's never really anyone new there. So it was quite interesting when a new priest, a man in his late 50s, had joined the congregation, having come over from India. My grandfather, also a priest in a local temple, had personally helped him obtain a visa, having known him from where he lived there in his younger years. When my great-uncle died a few months after he arrived, he even took the lead at his funeral. He quickly became popular with everyone. He was constantly talking to people and seemed like a nice man. He was always smiling and laughing and telling jokes and was popular with most. My mom one day pointed out to me that he was very touchy-feely with the kids, like he was always tickling them and picking them up, even the kids that were too old to be picked up. From that moment onwards, I was very conscious of the fact that it was odd how often he would take up the opportunity to do so. I come from a big family and have countless cousins. 2 of them, who were sisters and were 5 and 7 at the time, I had noticed were often in his presence. Their parents were quite happy for them to run around the temple and do as they wished, something which when growing up my parents had forbidden me to do. I personally felt at the time that running around somewhere at such a young age and being out of sight of your parents was not right, but I had no say in what they were and were not allowed to do. One Sunday, my cousins both come downstairs. The older one is crying like crazy, something I've not seen her do since she was little. It was out of character for her to get so upset. Her parents were trying to find out what had happened, but she wouldn't stop crying to speak. I managed to find the younger one and asked her what had happened. She said that she didn't know, but that she had seen her sister come out of the priest's room. He lived in the temple and had a bedroom upstairs, and was crying, so she brought her downstairs. Immediately this set off alarm bells, so I told my mom, and she spoke to my cousin's family about it. Now, coming from an Asian family, there is so much honor bullshit that is prevalent in the culture. From that point on, her family went quiet. They stopped coming around to our house and disappeared from the temple on Sundays. The priest was still in his job. My mom and I were both at a loss of what to do. Without speaking to my cousin about what happened, we could do nothing, and throwing around accusations without any evidence is an extremely dangerous game. About 3 weeks after the incident and nothing having been done or said, we decided to visit her at her family's house. My mom rang ahead and said that she wanted to talk about what had happened with the family and my cousin. This turned out to be a mistake, as when we got there it was clear that they had told my cousin to lie. My mom and I took her upstairs to talk in a quiet room to ask what had happened. She told us that he invited her into his room to play and that he had pulled a scary face which had scared her and she got upset. We tried telling her that it was okay to tell us everything without putting any words in her mouth, but she stuck to that story. We were convinced her family had coached her not to say a thing. There wasn't a thing we could do and toyed with the idea that maybe that was the truth and maybe we were just being overly paranoid. That mindset went out the window when news broke that another girl's family had put in a complaint about inappropriate behavior around 2 months later. He was beaten up and hounded out of the country. He moved back to India, and my grandfather made sure to alert all of the local temples in the area about him. It burns that that scumbag spoke at my great-uncle's funeral and that he did something to my cousin. I don't know what he did, but I hope it wasn't something that she will struggle with for the rest of her life.